Tēnā koutou e whare. Nau mai hara mai, tēnei I o tātou kui whainga. I don't know if I do. Can you hear me? Yeah. I've got a big teacher's voice. Yeah. Nau mai hara mai, tēnei kui whainga, ki tēnei wāhi kāwha, ki te whakarongo ki tēnei rangatira, e hara mai ana ki Aotearoa. So in Māori language, I'm just welcoming you to the space, to our space here at Waikato Matarau, the University of Auckland, and of course, Faculty of Education and Social Work, to listen to be inspired by our guests. Mariana, no mai hara mai, ki tēnei wāhi. I want to acknowledge and mihi to the people of this place, Ngāti Whātua, upon whose land we stand. And I also want to mihi to those of us who bring on our shoulders, or in our minds, or in our hearts today, to this space and thinking about how we might suspend harm, foster justice, look after, care for, and teach our tamariki mokopuna, our children, our grandchildren. Yes. So just to start tonight, I'm going to start with a very quick kariki or an incantation that speaks to drawing from the elements around us to ensure that we might all be well in this space. So with that in mind, I say tūtaua mai I runga, tūtaua mai I raru, tūtaua mai I waho, tūtaua mai I roto. Kia taua I te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumi e kuie, tai kia. Welcome.
Thank you.
Aotearoa e te tāmaki makaurau, tāmaki herenga waka, tāmaki the place where we all moor our boats together and live as one. Kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and thank you so much for this wonderful meeting. And we are Souto and welcome everyone. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome together well-known scholar and activist Mariana Souto. And Mariana is the first guest of our Center for Global Childhoods, our interdisciplinary research center located here at the faculty. And it's also our first face-to-face event, pretty much since the beginning of 2020, when we inviting people from community to come in, and which is very, very special.
Yes.
And Mariana is on international board of our research center, which we are very grateful for. And
Thank you.
we've known each other for years through reconceptualizing the early childhood movement and AERA. And it's been really wonderful. We actually started to plan this in 2018, but it took us about 2 years for this to happen.
There was a pandemic in between there.
Something like that. Mariana has been, she was a leader of early childhood at the Teachers College at Columbia University, and also she started a really well-known scientific project between Columbia University and King's College London, where she also had an appointment. And more recently, through September last year, she became a president of the well-known Erickson Institute in Chicago, Illinois, and where she has made a lot of strategic changes, really indigenized the faculty and the institution, and fundraised, as I hear, many millions of dollars to sort of support activities and really support the students from marginalized groups to be able to come and study, and to become teachers and support research in this area. And she's also not shy to host people like Michelle Obama at her lunches and to really brush shoulders with political forces and to gain political support for a really lifelong pursuit of social justice.
Yes.
And,
Thank you.
the leadership of the field and commitment to teachers and families and children is well known around the world, and the work is so well known here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is not your first visit,
No.
and we hope it's not your last visit here. And we all know your work. You're a distinguished speaker and scholar, and you publish many books. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome you here, and we're all looking forward to hearing your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be with you here today. I know that in a lot of ways we have connected via Zoom, but it's not the same. It's not the building, the community, the movement, the potential for transformation that happens when people come together. So I hope that this is the beginning of really rethinking early childhood for all of us. I really want to thank Mark for the invitation and the University of Auckland. I really want to talk about ways of suspending harm and fostering justice via an expansive politics of belonging. But when we think about justice and belonging in early childhood education, oftentimes we think about access. For a long time, access to preschool, to early care and education has been prioritized, has been the main goal, whether it is pre-K, kindergarten. But access, we have come to find out, is not sufficient for us to engage in the pursuit of justice and really to foster belonging. In fact, earlier this year, a study by Dale Farron showed that young children from racialized backgrounds in Tennessee did worse if they did go to pre-K than if they had no preschool and early childhood education at all. So when children don't see themselves in their teachers, don't have their ways of speaking, their values, their practices, their families, their legacies and histories honored, we're actually inflicting harm in the name of early childhood education. We know that pre-K and early childhood education can be powerful if done right. But right according to whom? High quality pre-K and early childhood education, we know, have very significant impacts on the lives and future of children. But low quality pre-K can actually work to inflict harm and perpetuate trauma. We're all about talking about trauma-informed education. What about taking the first principle of our profession, which is to first do no harm? And that includes emotional, psychological, social, as well as physical harm. So if we know what we know and we continue doing it, aren't we implicated in the harm being caused and the trauma being extended onto children, families, and communities? Really, what we have realized is that these findings show that sometimes we tend to enact harms in the pursuit of justice. And I put justice between quotations because we'll talk about what justice means in different conceptualizations. Really modeling this harmful conceptualization of justice for pre-service and service teachers that then get passed on to young children. The notion of justice that oftentimes we navigate is based on English common law, which is part of the protection of property and safeguarding of privileges from the commoners. And therefore, it is no justice at all. It is the protection of entitlements and privileges. Of course, then we also have another conceptualization of justice. And you see here from the National Museum for African American History and Culture, that they talk about aspects and assumptions of white culture, and it is within the context of the United States. But I would venture to guess that because of the colonial legacy of the British Empire, there are lots of shared understanding. So you can see that justice according to white culture is based on English common law, protects property and entitlement. So we're going to change insofar as I don't have to give up anything, right? And intent, not impact, counts. So this is not the kind of justice that I want to talk about today. Also, I don't want to talk about criminal justice, which is no justice. It's really carcerality, the criminal state. From the perspective of criminal justice, we have that crime is a violation of the law and of the state. So the human being, the community, families, land, end up being disregarded or put in second plan. We have that violations create guilt, and that justice requires the state to determine the blame and impose the punishment. Who did it? What do they deserve? What rule or law did they break? Now, this conceptualization of justice actually informs lots of the behavior management systems in early childhood education classrooms. I'm not going to go there today, but I just want for you to think about how criminality and carcerality are very much part of the design of the management of bodies within early childhood classrooms. But the central focus of criminal justice is that offenders need to get what they deserve. It's not about doing right. It's not about healing. So today I really want to talk about and focus on restorative justice. It talks about respect, accountability, and I would even say that it's more answerability to communities that have been divested over time, healing and empathy. And the central focus here is that the victim needs and the offender responsibility are to repair harm. That when people are violated, we need to do something. We need to put right wrongs. So you may be wondering, okay, what about early childhood education? So today, I really want to invite you to embrace a restorative and transformative conceptualization of justice that focuses on the victim's needs and offender's responsibility for repairing harm. Of course, there have been a number of violations caused in and by early childhood education affecting racialized and intersectionally minoritized children, families, and communities. Here, I use this framework that was developed by Maisha Wen in 2020 to really identify some of those harms so that we can then disrupt them. Because if we are not naming the harms, then we may think that we are actually upholding justice, as we just talked a little bit about. So this framework is based on the fact that histories matter, race matters, justice matters, language matters, and all together, if we take those into consideration, then we can make futures matter. Futures don't matter without the history, without the racialization. So what harm has been caused? I want to get started with histories matter. In early childhood, there have been harms caused by a variety of things, but I'm going to focus specifically today on Samuel Morton's ranking of races by cranial capacity. Not only did Samuel Morton assumed that one's intelligence was linked to brain size in 1839, but he decided to discard the smaller skulls of white people and the larger skulls of Black people in unethical ways. And today, we still have the ranking of race by intelligence informing many of our imaginaries. Not individually, but societally. People think, oh, are white people smarter? It's like, no, this is a study that has. So back in the 1800s, Morton's skull measurements were used to justify the institution of chattel enslavement within the context of the United States. The rationale was if Africans were not the same species as whites, then enslaving them was okay because they weren't human. And therefore, it was more easily explained and excused. So I bring this up because ensuing fallacies associated with the stereotype and standard racist positions like these, the existence of IQs, of racial IQs, of measures of intelligence, of aptitude, that really uphold whiteness as the norm. And that have been rooted in eugenics from the very beginning. Of course, they continue to inform and disadvantage racialized young children, families, and communities. If the value that's being put forth is the value of competition and individualism, but if in my household, collaboration and familism are much more important, then I am by design disadvantaging and ignoring by really intentionally evading the responsibility of doing right by children. Of course, there are many other instances, but I wanted to start with that because it informs so much of what we know in early childhood in terms of assessments, in terms of diagnostics, in terms of readiness, in terms of language gaps and depths. All of these can be rooted into this study that was a manipulated study that operated in the assumption of cranial capacity being linked to intelligence. Now, we're going to switch to race matters. And I know that this is related. I'm going to go to the Clark and Clark study that really was a study that Dr. Clark conducted with 3 to 7-year-old children, and they wanted to see how Black children saw themselves. So by looking at the dolls, they realized that by the ages 3 to 7, Black children already saw themselves as less capable. They already saw themselves as not being as pretty, not being as good. Now, you may think, okay, this was in 1947. Like, how many years do we have to get over this? Just recently, there have been many redos of this study, not only within the context of the United States, but in the context of Italy, Australia, Mexico, Brazil, and in every single one, there have been similar reactions of children. So I wanted to share this video with you.
Which doll doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and have 2 eyes.
White and have blue
Which doll
eyes.
is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That dog.
So you can see there the psychological harm that continues to be enacted today, not in 1947, but as children look at notions of intelligence, of notions of beauty, of being good, having morality and ethics aligned in a very racialized way. By the time that children are in preschool classrooms and they're 3, they may run across the room and grab a black doll to be the monster, not because they are saying that Black people are monsters, but because their cartoons and books and stories have associated darker colors with badness and lighter colors with goodness. From the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf, throughout Disney stories and so many others. Now, we could say that this is related to specifically the US, but I also want to think about how is it that this harm traumatizes adults later on. So I'm going to show a snippet of a video, and I will make it available, the whole video, because it's 5 minutes for you to watch, because it's really powerful. From, for example, Southeast Asian woman whose mother used to put this cream on her skin, and her skin would burn. And she understood why, because her mother did not want her to experience the prejudices of having darker skin. And those are really a global phenomenon rooted in anti-Blackness. So here we go.
What I've seen growing up, dark skin equates to being poor, dirty, ratchet.
They tend to be bad guys in Tyler Perry movies, straight from the border.
That doesn't even make any sense. I'm not deemed as beautiful, therefore I am not beautiful. And those two are not really mutually exclusive.
Could it be that something as early as colonization or slavery is primarily responsible for our beauty standards today? We're talking about who works in the field and who works in the house. We're also talking about rape, the rape of slaves to produce people who are known as mulattoes or mixed race. These standards of beauty travel. Eurocentric standards of beauty travel.
In the Dominican society and our culture, they have a phrase that's like mejorando la raza, advancing the Dominican population and making sure we're going into how they say the better. If you're lighter, you're bettering the race and you're bettering the island, versus if you're just being you.
I would get called the Blackness. One joke that really stuck with me was like, oh, Edgar's so black that when he leaves a car, the check engine light turns on. That was a reference to my skin being as dark as oil. I felt ugly being of a darker skin tone. So I tried to gel my hair, or I started listening to skater punk music. So I tried culturally to lighten myself, if that makes sense.
I went on a trip to Korea with my mom. Some woman walked up to my mom and she asked, "Why is your daughter so dark?" In Korea, you have to be pale, and I almost felt like a foreigner and not so much Korean anymore. When we turn off the lights, they say, "Oh, Salorn, where did you go?" Or, "Oh, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl." Are you saying that my race and just the fact that I am Black, is that not attractive in general?
So I wanted to show you that because, and I think we can switch the lights, yeah. I wanted to show you that because of the effects. These adults are reflecting on their childhood and how they experience the harm that you watch the 3 to 7-year-olds respond with the doll study. Really showing how the depth of the trauma being caused really marks their life. So what are we going to do to suspend harm if we're really serious about justice? Now, we're going to consider how justice matters and really think about what does it mean, because it cannot really be equated with carcerality. Carcerality is not justice. The protection of the royals against the commoners, that's not justice. You can ask any 3-year-old and they will tell you, although we've been socialized to believe that that's the case. So we've talked a little bit about justice, but the 3 questions that I want for us to always consider is who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these? Who has been hurt? Oftentimes people who have been minoritized, who have been oppressed intergenerationally, whose communities have been robbed, divested, whose communities have experienced erasure. Their needs oftentimes have to do with seeing themselves, feeling valued, being enough, but much more than that. Now, whose obligations are these? All of our obligation. And part of that is that restorative justice really purports that we're all part of the broader community. And therefore, regardless of whether we individually caused that harm or not, we're answerable and we need to do something about it. You can see here that really restorative justice focuses on the harm and the needs, and that the ultimate thing is to put right the wrongs. It involves people who have legitimate stake in the situation, not just judges, lawyers, but community members who can tell you what has been stripped from their community intergenerationally, the trauma that has been caused, the losses that have occurred. And to put things right require that we do 2 things, that we address the harms, but also address the causes. Because if we only address the harms, then we're just putting Band-Aids into really a wound that gets deeper and broader each and every day. And we can say, well, I can see it, but you're actually evading the responsibility of seeing it. In fact, when people use the term blindness, whether it is color blindness, we are using an ableist term. If you know, for example, that the top of this bottle is blue and that my watch or that my vest is black, you're not colorblind. You can see color. You can differentiate color. Yet, what we choose not to see is a lot of times what requires us to give up our privilege. So we need to both think about the harms, but also the causes here. And really thinking about how then language matters. And language matters more than just talking about it. Sometimes teachers will say, sometimes people will say, well, you know, that's family. They don't really spend time with them. That family is terrible. They don't care. But in my class, I treat every child the same. You don't, because there's the context where you're really thinking about that child as lesser than and your role as being savior. So April Baker Bell has coined this term anti-Black linguistic racism, and it's really pervasive in early childhood classrooms. Examples of these practices that enacting harm on racialized and intersectionally minoritized children are standards for early learning, which include academic language. What is academic language, aside from the language of those who are in power? The difference between a language and a dialect is not linguistic. It has to do with power, who has power and who doesn't. Subject-verb agreements. Within the context of the United States, they is was incorrect until the Associated Press decided that it was correct. But African Americans had been used for generations. But because it was racialized, it was deemed incorrect. So who gets to sanction what's correct? Interactional norms. Can I just interrupt, or do I have to raise my hand? And how are we constructing problems when we expect children to behave the way that we expect and not the way that they behave at home? Like, I grew up in a household that it was an art for you at the lunch table or dinner table to find just the right moment to cut in the conversation. And so there's no such a thing as raising hands, like you'll be ignored forever. But we construct issues with children who are constructed as being rude, as not following the rules, as not managing themselves, as needing extra help in self-regulation. Conventions of politeness. And I'll tell you a short story of my own 15-year-old when he was a toddler, which is, the English is very interesting because a lot of times we ask questions when we're greeting. When we say, hi, how are you? And someone says, oh, I'm terrible. I had just this jet lag. I spent the whole night up. I didn't, by the way, but you're like, that's not what I wanted to know. That's too much information. But you actually asked, but the question is not actually a question, even though it has a question mark at the end. And I see some of you, I was the one that it's like, okay, you just asked and you walked right by me. Because that question is a greeting. It's not really meant to be a question, but if you're not part of the insider culture, you don't know. The other thing is, would you like to? In my home, if I need my kids to go bathe, I would say go bathe or go clean up, right? So when my youngest, Thomas, was in the toddler classroom, his teacher had asked him, would you like to clean up? And he said no, and continued playing. His teacher, who is an early childhood researcher and just amazing, I went to pick him up and she said, oh, I wanted to let you know, and she's laughing, saying like, I want to let you know that Thomas said today, when I asked him, would you like him to clean up? He said no. So I talked to Thomas at home and I said, Annie thought that this was rude. And the next day she asked him to clean up. Would you like to clean up? And he said, no, thank you. That was not the preferred response, right? But like he was in a home of two parents with doctorates. Imagine the construction of the problem if he wasn't. I was chairing the department that oversaw the preschool. And even then, there was this, So how is it that language positions kids problematically? And then the devaluing of orality, which overprivileged written text, which have done harm to indigenous and Black communities for generations. So how is it that we're re-traumatizing when everything that matters is in written text? Now, of course, that we also have the labels, and put here, label jars, not people, because language is arguably the most powerful tool for justice and injustice. Deficit labels denigrate the abilities and experiences of children, and children come to internalize those. Those become really tools for self-oppression. So if we accept this view of language as behavior that makes things happen, then the labels, what we call children, have much more impact than we would like to admit. Now, of course, that these are just a few examples. I'm sure that you can think of many, many more, but like a lot of times we don't really pay attention to language. Like we talk about sometimes minority, when in reality, demographically, the global majority is comprised of multilingual children of color. But it's the power that minoritizes, even though demographically we comprise the majority. So as we bring all of these together in terms of histories, race, justice, language, we can then make futures matter. And these are tools for investigation and analysis. I hope you will pick them up in different realms. These are just like quick examples of how harm has been caused throughout the history of early childhood and education at large. This future that we can build is marked by justice, by healing, by repairing harms and righting wrongs. It really does require a North Star logic, which requires defending the whiteness that has historically been sedimented in early care and education, rereading early years education in plural and expansive ways. What is appropriate for whom? Whose power is being appropriated and centered, right? And this necessarily means appending restrictive and exclusionary notions of early childhood education along with its priorities framed by whiteness. So a lot of times we want for children to self-feed independently by 18 months as the developmentally appropriate practice guide issued by the National Association of Early Childhood the educators of young children say. So Macy says that by 18 months, children are supposed to self-feed. Now, my mother fed my kids for as long as she possibly could to foster the interdependence intergenerationally and foster the closeness. That it didn't matter if the kids were in kindergarten, she was trying to spoon feed them at the table. That cultural practice then disadvantages kids because, like, can you believe that they can't even self-feed? So the deficit, the looking at what children are not doing, families are not doing, that really creates problems. And a lot of times what we need is this North Star toward freedom. We don't know what it looks like yet, but we know that where we are is not the right place. So abolitionists have used it as a way of guiding themselves toward freedom. Now, I want to switch a little bit to another aspect, from justice to another aspect of early childhood education that's very key, and it is part of justice within the context of early childhood education, which is belonging. Belonging, really, a lot of times we put these posters that says, you belong here. Saying you belong here doesn't make it so. In fact, it gives us the cop-out not to have to address the lack of belonging. It's like, okay, it's there, it must be true. But despite the importance of belonging to early education, regardless of your perspective, even if you are a developmentalist and are thinking about attachment, there is the importance of belonging. If you are a critical scholar or educator and you're thinking about community and organizing for change, children have to have their need to belong met. And belonging is deeply entwined with hierarchies of power in society. So to belong means oftentimes to assimilate, to be included tangentially, so exclusion via inclusion, or to erase part of who you are. It really is deeply rooted in the politics of racialized exclusion. And early childhood education has embraced this rhetoric of belonging as if it were static, but it isn't. It is a political project that continues to marginalize and continues to cause harm and trauma. So with that, I want for you just to, for 1 minute, and I know it's hardly adequate, but we'll get there, to consider in our classrooms and our preschools, whose belonging is ensured and whose belonging is questioned. So turn to the person next to you, and if you don't, just go across the aisle and talk to each other for a minute or so. I know he doesn't want to follow directions. Okay, I know that this was not enough, but these are questions that I hope that you will continue to ask, whether it is that you're at the university setting and you look at your syllabus and think about whose belonging is ensured, whose belonging is questioned. How do I know? How do I make it so? So as you were talking, can some of you share whose belonging is ensured in the preschool or in the classroom? Can anyone? English speakers, right. So English tends to be the norm, and not only English, but proper English, right? Because there's also the notion of broken English, which is a power differential there. Whose belonging is questioned?
Children from minority groups.
Absolutely. And also those of us who don't look like the role, right? Oftentimes, as a professor at Columbia and then now president of Erickson, people look at me and go like, oh, many times at Columbia, now I can't do that because my picture's everywhere, like the website. But at Columbia, people used to come and try to meet with me, and then they would say, can you help me get to Professor Souto Manning's office? And they assumed that I was the assistant. And so I sent them, and then I walked in. I said, hi, I'm Professor Souto Manning. It's nice. And they were mortified. But like, what are the images that we have about who looks the part? And how do we make assumptions related to that? You know, a lot of times the visible, as you think about in terms of minoritized children, racialized children, you are on the receiving end regardless of education, regardless of preparation. Again, with Thomas, my youngest, I remember taking my oldest to public school in New York and pushing his stroller up the hill in the Upper West Side. And someone stopped me, this woman, and said, I hear you go to Columbia. And I looked at her strange because, yes, I was a professor there. So I guess I did go there, but I don't think that that's exactly what she meant. And she said, how much do you charge? And I looked at her and said, what do you mean? Said for babysitting, because she immediately assumed that my light-skinned child, my youngest is lighter skin and white passing, and my oldest is darker, that I could not possibly be his mother, right? So what assumptions, how does that actually impact early childhood education and the relationships between teachers and families? So belonging is really complex. It's not simply a competency to be achieved by the child. And a lot of times we attribute that. It's like, oh, you need to work so that you belong here. Well, it's not on the child. We try to remediate the child when in reality we need to reorganize the politics of belonging within the early childhood classroom. It really needs to be reconceptualized in the pursuit of justice as the right of every child, each and every child, and the responsibility of educators. It should not be, oh, you deal with that. You figure out how to belong. And these harms enacted by the exclusion that are really put in place by these restrictive politics of belonging really need to be suspended. Yuval Davis has written about how belonging is political. And this current politics of belonging works to maintain borders and boundaries. These borders and boundaries serve three purposes: to order, to order, and to border. And so, but a lot of times those are invisible or invisibilized. They're not quite noticeable by those who are part of the dominant group, and they're hyper visible by those of us who are not. And it's really important for us to try to map out the borders that exist within the context of preschools, within the context of early childhood. And we can only do so in true partnerships. Because some of us are in the position of dismantling, some of us are in the position of mapping. And of course, those positions are very fluid, but it's not just the job of one group, but all of us. Racialized children are routinely denied belonging. They undergo processes of assimilation, which are psychologically problematic, erasure, trying not to be themselves and perform someone else, and really subjugation, feeling lesser than, feeling that they need to be approved in order to belong. And so these are practices, everyday practices that inflict harm at the emotional, social, and psychological level, and that have long-term consequences, as you saw in the video of the adults recounting some of their experiences earlier on. So intersectionally minoritized and racialized children are often told that to belong, they must reject the communicative practices, values, and experiences of their families and communities. Their identities are constantly under siege. If you want to go to biology, you can think about how the identity is being under siege means that the cortisol levels go up and brain development is affected negatively. So it has real consequences. They feel pressured to undergo processes of erasure and assimilation, eventually experiencing a stimulative shift over time with their self-identities and sense of belonging. And many times they're asked to choose between their home and community and school. And then we're surprised when they decide to leave school and prioritize homes and communities, when in reality we have, by design, pushed them out by causing harm. White children need to disrupt their too often over-exaggerated sense of themselves and of their place in the world. Their knowledges, perspectives, and practices become exemplars, norms, baselines. And so they need to start troubling that. Otherwise, if they see whiteness everywhere, that is at the foundation of white supremacy. They need to unlearn in order to learn about the brilliance of racialized individuals, families, and communities, and fully commit and move toward a more just future. Many of them are schooled to think that that's not their problem. It is. So the field's long-standing politics of belonging doesn't fully consider how deeply emotional belonging is, how not belonging impairs the self-esteem and self-actualization of children, having dire consequences over time. And the denial of belonging excludes, marginalizes, and inflicts emotional harm at the very least. Historically, it can cause trauma. What I am going to suggest is that we think about a little bit of a paradigm shift from diversity and inclusion to justice and belonging. And part of that is that diversity and inclusion a lot of times happen at the intrapersonal level. It's about yourself and self-discovery, about your biases. But that doesn't result in action. That oftentimes actually puts up a barrier because it's like, I don't feel good about that. I was better where I was before. But the justice and belonging happen at the interpersonal, which is the relationships with others. So how can I interrupt the microaggressions that are impacting and causing injustice and harm? And how can I organizationally, within the context of my classroom, of my preschool community, how can I promote justice by centering micro-affirmations? And for those of you who may or may not be familiar, racial microaggression is, I often get asked as I travel in planes, where are you from? And I used to say, New York, because I spent almost 20 years in New York. Where are you really from? Manhattan. Where are your people from? Right? Those are ways of saying you don't belong. Those are microaggressions. Or, why do you sound so white? Your name is so hard to pronounce. Can I call you Mary? Or not even asking, just calling you Mary Anna instead of Mariana. Right? So those are microaggressions that we need to identify and interrupt. And so microaggressions were first coined by Chester Pierce and colleagues, psychiatrists at Harvard. And these microaggressions are subtle, stunning, often automatic and nonverbal exchanges that serve as put-downs. It's like, you're lesser than somehow. Now, Lindsay Perez-Ubich and Daniel Solórzano have come up with the concept of racial microaggressions, which is one form of systemic everyday racism, using to keep those at the margins, the social margins in their place. It's like, okay, you can enter, but you have to stay there. You can't quite rock the boat, ruffle feathers, or anything. Common microaggressions are feeling out of place because of race or because of ethnicity. Teachers are having lower expectations for kids. Oh, poor kid. They don't have help at home. Therefore, I'm lowering my expectations instead of upping the levels of support. And subtle and not so subtle experiences with racial discrimination. Last Wednesday, I was boarding a plane to DC for the NAYC conference. And I was boarding group one. I had not been upgraded, but I was boarding group one. And this white woman just grabs my arm and says, they're boarding group one. And I said, I know. I mean, if I had a ticket for every time that someone stopped me from boarding with first class or business, I'd be traveling the world for the rest of my life. So I share that because those have real consequences, deep consequences. Racial microaffirmations, on the other hand, and this is a concept that they came up with in this book, are everyday forms of affirmation and validation that people of color engage in public and private settings, the nods, the smiles, the embraces, the use of language and other actions to express acknowledgement, respect, and self-worth. They're subtle, verbal and nonverbal strategies that people of color, indigenous people, engage that affirm each other's dignity, integrity, and shared humanity. And these allow us to feel acknowledged, respected, and valued in a society that constantly seeks to dehumanize us historically. It's not an issue of the individual, but of society. So now that we've gone through a lot of the ideas, I want to show you a couple of examples, and then I'll stop for questions. So microaffirmations in action means that we need to counter microaggressions and foster microaffirmations in our teaching pedagogically every day. This means that racial microaffirmations in the education of young children demand a pedagogical framework of expansive belonging. That means that all of these factors are playing together. Paradigms in child development need to center Black, Indigenous, and child of color. Otherwise, they are being racist. Racially just pedagogies. How are my pedagogies sustaining racial justice? How are my materials reflecting and centering Black, Indigenous, and other racialized children? How are my ways of making meaning and making sense overshadowing or perhaps being overprivileged over the Black, Indigenous, and racialized children's and communities' practices, values? How are those positioned in teaching? And finally, really thinking about the values, voices, and expertise, because although we may have more schooling, many community members have education that no schooling will ever afford. And so centering the rights of Black, Indigenous, and children of color to be children, ensuring that their practices are centered, fostering their belonging, cultivating their full humanity, and partnering, really partnering, learning from and with communities from a humble stance, from a stance that there's no way that each one of us knows everything, but we're also not ignorant of everything. And there's more expertise distributed in a community than in any one person or group of people. So with that, I want to go to the examples of names, microaffirmations in action. Jamila Tompkins Bigelow came up with this book, authored this book, Your Name is a Song. And in this book, the main character says, the mother says, may that name come from dreamers. Their real names were stolen long ago, so they dream up new ones. So names like Trayvon, for instance, that gets made fun of or not being seen as normal. And one of the things that she does,
My name is Jamila.
hold on, I'm going to just go back a little. One of the things that she does is she invites us to suspend our microaggressions by treating names the same. So if you could just put the volume a little bit up, is there a possibility? If not, that's okay. I want for you to follow along with Jamila, okay? Let's go.
Hello, my name is Jamila Tompkins Bigelow, and I am the author of Your Name is a Song. Today I'm going to pronounce the many names that are in the book Your Name is a Song. These are common pronunciations for the names. However, please note, someone might have one of these names, but pronounce it quite differently. Please always take the time to listen to how someone pronounces their own name. If you're not sure, be sure to ask them. Let them know that it's important to you to get their name right. Let's begin.
Ahlam, Anderson, Benjamin, Bilkis. And so she goes on to Bob and to many other names, so that she's not differentiating between names that are quote unquote normal, which are aligned to whiteness, with other names. And that creates really a way of exploring names, because even if they're the same, how do you know that a name, that Tara or Tara, how do you know? Unless you ask, unless you learn. So kindergarten teachers took this up and invited the children to interview an adult in their life about the story of their names. And they came back with that story, of course, orally, and they couldn't wait to share. And they put together a class name called No Name is the Same, name stories from these teachers' kindergarten. So I'm going to ask to share with you a couple of the pages so that you can see what it looks like. So this is Navea's page. Navea was a child with disabilities and who received speech and language pathology services. Her speech and language pathologist saw this page and said, I'm so glad to know. I just thought her name was weird. Imagine that somebody who was supposed to be including her thought that she was weird, but said, Navea is my name. No, Navea is the same. So said, my name is Navea. My mommy said I was a miracle. I am from heaven. My first name is Heaven spelled backwards, right? So there is a whole other understanding there. And the kids use voice to text as a way of altering their text technology. Here is Ryan, and Ryan arrived and he was a very shy and silent child until this happened. And he wrote, he said, Grandma calls me baby, bao bao in Chinese. And every time that somebody came to the symbols for bao bao, they had to go to him because they did not know how to read. So Ryan went from being the child who didn't know anything to the child without whom no one could actually read the whole book, right? So the power there, and you can see here that there is translation of the pattern in the book. These are just common words. But that's one example of how kids can learn about each other as unique human beings, affirm each other's humanity. Another example is through histories. And this is in a second grade classroom. So Julius Lester has written this book and he wrote, I am a story, so are you. My story begins the same way yours does. I was born on, and then he wrote, many people and many events are part of my story and yours too. So really thinking about how to engage in this work. So the second grade teacher invited the kids to bring a significant adult in their lives or an older person to explore the story of their lives around their birthday. So that instead of having competitions for who brought the best cake or the best treats or whatever, everyone had something special, that story that only the parents or only the people who were adults in their lives could tell. So you can see here Amelia and her dad being interviewed by second graders about the day that she was born. And it was the day that she was born within the context of that family or that community, not the day that they were biologically, physically born. So I'm going to show, and they really they explored so many kinds of diversity because there were kids who had same-sex parents. There were kids whose, there was a parent who was from Palestine, a mother. There was a family that was Israeli. And then kids are talking about Israeli-Palestine conflict in second grade, right? They also started seeing these sonograms and they're like, why are they so grainy? They're like, well, it's because sounds become pictures. They're like, how? We didn't know that. So we invited the radiologist from Columbia Presbyterian to come and explain to them because this is high school content. And this was a school serving over 80% of children below the poverty line. So here's a video. Let me see here. That shows a little bit.
Mom, Dad, Grandma, and my grandma and grandpa from Nashville came for my birthday.
The day that Kai was actually born, I wasn't there. She was born in Arusha, which is in Tanzania, in a hospital, which is very rare because Kai is Maasai. She's from one of the oldest tribes ever.
So I'm not going to go through the rest of it, but she talks about how, in a way, what's really special is not the celebration. What's really special is that story. And every family, every member has that story of how they came to be within the context of the families. Now, every single family showed up because it wasn't to put bulletin boards up or make copies. It was for them to share their expertise that nobody else had. The kids were so excited about it. So these are examples of this framework in action. And there are many more, but I wanted just to show how simple this can be put forward. So I want to just bring us to a close and hopefully to some question and answer. My hope here today is that you will commit or recommit countering microaggressions while fostering, cultivating, and sustaining microaffirmations in and through teaching, thereby centering joy, love, and the humanity of all children of color, which are often dehumanized, pursuing justice in early childhood education as an everyday project and action. But my greatest hope is that we can work as a field intentionally, collectively, and systematically to suspend harm and foster justice via the cultivation of expansive spaces for belonging in early care and education. Until then, we are not going to experience justice, belonging, and the humanization of society ourselves. So let's make change happen. Thank you.
Mariana, and we have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you. Kia ora.
I was working with a group of teachers writing some lessons on mental health education.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things the teachers in that group said to me on that day, we were all talking about our different lessons, was teachers need to do these lessons.
Right.
Not children. Teachers need to do these lessons with each other. So I'm wondering about, as a teacher education institution, what advice you might have for us about how we might integrate this idea of microaffirmations into our work.
Absolutely. So I think that first of all, we need to identify the harms being caused, right? So within the context of our programs, they start by realizing their own miseducation. So they read books such as An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young Children, Stamped for Kids, and they thought we were enemies by George Takei, which is a graphic novel. And they are reading initially, thinking about how they might approach that in the classroom, but they come to the realization very quickly and they become upset that they themselves didn't know those things because they had been miseducated. And so instead of thinking about them as being inadequate, they start looking at the schooling system and really how they need to promote change there, right? So we need to really think about, now that you know, what are some of the microaggressions that you have committed, because we all do. We live in a racist world. And so we are always, a good friend of mine, Patrick Kamangian, says, hi, my name is Patrick and I'm a recovering racist. Because we are all living in this world that we are thinking like, oh, this person is not smelling too good in the subway. That person might be homeless, right? We jump to assumptions. We jump to assumptions related to gender. We jump to assumptions related to language. So really thinking about how can we start mapping and being honest, and then thinking about how do we flip that? What are some of the microaggressions? How do I then flip? And that has to do a lot with future casting in terms of rehearsing change, because it doesn't feel right. So teachers can then rehearse change. If you say, for example, oh, I love that child, but the family, they don't really care. They don't. And then you can say, oh, I hear you say that you love that child, but it's really hard to love a child when you don't love where the child comes from. So help me understand here. And then really thinking about, instead of being at odds with each other, pushing, so that we can think about shifting from microaggressions to microaffirmations. Now, there are different kinds of microaggressions as well. I didn't go into that. But sometimes it has to do with, for example, who is the person who is in science, for instance, and who's the person who you feel, oh, they don't look like a scientist, or they don't look like a doctor, you look like a doctor, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, you're Chinese, you must know how to play the violin. It's like, right? So, and some of them are propagated in media. Some of them, and really thinking about, oh, you must be quiet, you must be reserved. So if you're not, all of a sudden you have these understandings. So I think that part of it is creating that space for learning, for them to be vulnerable, understanding that we're always learning and that we're repairing harms in our own lives, because we may have been schooled, but in many ways we have been miseducated. So then it becomes a collective project forward. I hope that helps. Another question? Anyone? Comment?
This isn't a question, but just something that you've made me think about further is in our early childhood curriculum in New Zealand, Mariki, one of the principles is the principle of belonging. And I don't think, and it's the way that we understand belonging is problematized, but you've just made me think further about how we, how people have, how sometimes to gain a sense of belonging in a centre, children might have to reject.
Right. Absolutely. So lots of the Nordic countries have belonging as a principle, but it's belonging as a fixed construct, something to acquire, as opposed to belonging as a way of reorganizing the classroom, right? Because first of all, you have to think about who is immediately ascribed belonging and who's not, who's denied, and the consequences of that. Oh, you speak great English. You don't, it's like, really, who's ascribed to be a good student? Who's ascribed to, oh, the parent must have forgotten to sign, as opposed to the parent did not sign. Then we have this push and pull between kids wanting to keep themselves and love on their families, communities, and abide by the values and principles, and wanting to belong in the classroom. And that push and pull, that destabilization, is really harmful, because regardless of whether they assimilate but keep their home culture, they are really saying, okay, the home culture is not as good as, or at least they're different, or they're engaging in processes of erasure and not necessarily embracing the values that really have fed the community and the families for generations. Not only that, but then we expect kids who don't fit the dominant group to take an extra step. You have to perform belonging in a certain way in order to be seen as well-behaved, in order to be seen as succeeding academically. So instead of trying to push belonging onto children, it's really important for us to turn the mirror on ourselves and think about, how do I reorganize so that the borders that exist are abolished, and so that the politics of belonging is more expansive? Because we can really expand the politics of belonging. It doesn't have to be exactly as it is, but it does take work because it's been restricted for so long. Yes, so I think that one of the things about research is realizing again that humility and stance, that like we can collaborate together. So the best kinds of research that are going to foster belonging and identify harms and try to really ensure that there is justice and belonging have to do with, again, a more expansive community of who belongs as researcher, community members, children, teachers, researchers. We're all academics. We're all researchers in our own right. And I think that a lot of times when we put ourselves as researcher and everyone else as not being researcher, we actually don't ask questions that are as in-depth related to the politics of the positioning within society and schools. So I hope that this is helpful. But I will say that, like, before I was working with a teacher with Jessica in second grade, and that's why the name story, I said we, not the name story, the history of us, that I said we did these, we co-taught every Friday for 3 years. And there were things that we had to do, because we talked quite a bit about what would I be called? Would I be called Dr. Souto Manning? No, because that would position me at a different parameter. So we went with Miss Mariana. So I was Miss Mariana. She's like, you cannot wear heels. You cannot, because I happen to think that heels are comfortable. So I'm like, okay. So there were all of these things for me to fit within the context of the classroom. And oftentimes we don't quite do that. We just show up instead of thinking about what are the norms of belonging within this community? How do I actually position myself as worthy. So what Jessica did was I came in, I asked her if I could come. She's like, okay, come on Friday so you don't disrupt the flow of the week. Get there, and she gives me a box of assessments. She's like, okay, go, reading assessments. So I go every Friday, like for the first month, and I do this English reading assessments that I don't agree with, but she has to do. She doesn't agree with either. So I'm like, okay, I'm done. And then she gives me the Spanish box because it's a bilingual teacher. And those were the learning the ropes for her to feel that I was going to be serious in a relationship as a researcher, that I wasn't just going to extract, but that I was going to really collaborate and problem solve with her. So I think that as we think about the politics of belonging, oftentimes researchers have access to early education, but early education doesn't have access to researchers, which is something else that she pushed. So she's like, you're here all the time, but it's been over 10 years since I've been in a university classroom. And I was like, oh, yes, I thought that we had flattened this power hierarchy, but obviously no. So we started co-teaching, not only Fridays in her year 2 classroom, but also the university course that I was teaching. And so one informed the other. But it does take a lot of time and investment, and it doesn't necessarily align with the system of publications being individual counting and so on. So, but that is a system that is based on the notion of justice, very much aligned with English common law. So hopefully that gives you a few more, but feel free to get in touch related to that. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Mark Farrow, the Dean of the Faculty of Schools of Beta. Thank you, Mariana, very much.
Thank you.
Address tonight. I always spoil these talks by going on too long to say one thing, but I just wanted to go back to the one thing you said at the beginning, which was, thinking about our role in causing harm, and at the end, thinking about how we as researchers cause harm, how we as teachers cause harm, and how we as teachers of teachers cause harm, and actually reflecting on that constantly as people working in this faculty. We've had a couple of times this year in this very lecture theatre where we've had somebody to challenge us to do that. Hunter O'Regan talked to us earlier in the year about sharing some of the stories you were sharing about your children and some of the reactions you got, telling stories about her children in the New Zealand schooling system and the racism and the harm that is done to them on a daily basis. So you're another in the series of helping us reflect on the harm that we cause and the things that we need to do to address that in our role as part of the University of Auckland. So it's been just fantastic to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm also reminded that we have the same colonial masters. You are better at throwing them off than we were. We still have, we're still British subjects in this country. We're the crown in this country, so we haven't quite got there yet. So that's one bit of harm that I hope we can, in our lifetime, get rid of. So we'll talk about that later.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.